All right, so here's the app, and the edge case basically happens when we input some data. So we make some data. So we say, I went for a walk. And then when we input this, of course, it gets an entry in the history list. So I went for a walk in today's date. It also gets a calendar list. But now the problem is that when we remove this entry, it now becomes an entry with an empty string. So we basically, we don't render it because it's an empty string, but then we have an empty date here. And we still have a marked entry here, which is very ugly. Okay, so how do we fix that issue? Fixing the issue is not very hard, but it's kind of hacky because what we now do, so the solution I chose, is that if we input some data here, so I went for a walk, then of course we make an entry. But now the fix that I made is that if we exit the text field, it basically checks for all the states whether they're empty states, and then if there are empty states, we remove them. So this is basically where it happens. Here we handle the edit, and then first we check whether we actually have today's date, and otherwise we create it. Otherwise, if that's not true, we already have it, then we simply edit the item. What I added here is a function called handle blur. And handle blur gets called when you exit the text field, so the text field gets blurred. What we then say is, okay, so if we exit the text field, check whether the text is empty. This is actually not needed, but it just removes the computational load just a bit. And then we dispatch the action remove empty items to the state. And this is the function called remove empty items, or the state remove empty items. We have a function that checks whether for a given message all the three fields are empty. Then we use a filter function to basically get a list of IDs of all the messages that have three empty fields. And then we basically filter out the messages that do not have this. How this works in Redux is that we first spread out the state. So that's the whole state, which basically makes a copy. And then we overwrite the messages object. And we overwrite the messages object by taking the state, then the messages, then using a filter to return the items where this thing evaluates to true. And the ID to delete is an array which has all the IDs that we want to delete. So if the messages ID is in that, if our current message ID is in that ID to delete, then that returns true, but we don't want that, so then we return that false. So that's how we fixed it. In summary, I basically check whether the state contains empty data every time a user exits a text field.